order, I call Philip Davies.
Thank you very much, Mrs Osborne, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity of being able to bring this debate to the House today. One of the starkest examples of just how politically correct this country has become is over the issue of women in the justice system, and more specifically for this debate, women in prison and in courts. Just about 5% of the prison population at any one time in recent history has been female, the other 95% male. Yet so much time, effort, concentration and browbeating has taken place over this very small number of women in prison. There are countless groups and organisations calling for this number to be reduced. There are far too many politicians, male as well as female, willing to trot out politically correct nonsense on the subject, repeating facts that don't bear any scrutiny at all. And there are far too many calls for something to be done, a problem that by anybody's standards it's hard to see exists based on the actual evidence. Let's just imagine for one moment that the male population in prison represented just 5% of the total, and that women made up the remaining 95% of the total. Would there be an outcry on behalf of these men at the expense of the women? Of course not. There's absolutely no chance on earth that this would happen. So why is there all of this concern over 5% of the prison population? How can normally thoughtful, intelligent people have taken such leave of their senses over this issue? I would suggest that the answer is simple. It's all about being politically correct, and not many people in public life like to challenge it. I do, Mrs Osborne, and today I want to take the opportunity to scotch some myths about all types of sentencing for women. And there are 5 myths in particular that I want to bust. There's an old political maxim that if you tell a lie often enough, people will believe it's true. And I can only conclude that this has happened on this particular issue. And the story for me, Mrs Osborne, begins really because I heard this particular lie so many times from people that women are more likely to be sent to prison than men, they're treated much more harshly by the courts, and I was taken in by it too. I presumed it was true because I'd heard it so often. I thought it must be true, and I thought it was an absolute outrage, and it prompted me. I was so outraged by this inequality in sentencing that I decided to do some research into it. And as many people know, I spend an awful lot of time researching matters to do with prisons and sentencing and justice, and I wanted to get to the bottom of why women were being treated so badly. So imagine my surprise when, having looked upon all the evidence, it wasn't that women are treated more harshly by courts when it comes to sentencing them. The absolutely unequivocal evidence is that, on the contrary, women are actually treated far, far more favourably by the courts when it comes to sentencing than men. And there are 5 particular myths that I want to expose today. The first myth is quite a simple one. The myth is that women are very likely to be sent to prison and are more likely than men to be given a custodial sentence. Mrs Osborne, this is quite simply untrue. Everyone I've spoken to is involved with the justice system confirms anecdotally that this is not the case. But let's not just take their word for it, let's look at the facts. I asked the House of Commons Library to provide the evidence that more women were being sent to prison than men, as I'd been told was the case. Not only did they not provide this information, they confirmed that the exact opposite is in fact true. The Library said, and I quote, "The published statistics show that a higher proportion of men are given a sentence of immediate custody than women, irrespective of age of offender, juveniles, young adults or adult, and the type of court, magistrates or crown. This has been the case in each year between 1999 and 2009, for which the figures they looked at. For each offence group, a higher proportion of males are sentenced to custody than females. In 2009, 58% of male offenders who entered a guilty plea for an indictable offence were given an immediate custodial sentence, compared to just 34% of women. For each offence group..." Of course I'll give way.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Could he clarify whether the information he received from the House of Commons Library also looked at statistics by type of offence?
Yes, absolutely. They absolutely look. They look at every category of offence. And for every single category of offence, women are less likely to be sent to prison than men. I'll give way.
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman. I congratulate him on this important debate, and I hope that at the end of it we certainly will have made sure that we're not peddling myths but facts. Would he like to comment on the fact that whilst 70% of men are in prison for a non-violent offence, 81% of women are? Doesn't that suggest that while some statistics may favour women, that one most certainly doesn't?
No, it certainly doesn't mean that at all. The figures that the Honourable Lady quotes, and that these groups are often fond of quoting, actually goes to show the exact opposite of what they think it shows. It actually goes to show that actually women are treated more favourably by the courts than men. But I'll give the detail to her. If she'll let me continue with the speech, it will become self-evident to her, I hope. And if she still has any remaining queries towards the end, I'll happily give way to her again if these figures don't make any sense. But I'm sure even to the Honourable Lady these figures will make perfect sense. I will continue with the quote from the House of Commons Library, if I may, Mrs Osborne. In 2009, 58% of male offenders who entered a guilty plea for an indictable offence were given an immediate custodial sentence compared to 34% of women. For each offence group, a higher proportion of males pleading guilty were sentenced to immediate custody than females. The Ministry of Justice's publication called Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System, November 2010, which is produced to ensure there is no sex discrimination in the system, says, and I quote, of sentenced first-time offenders, 7,320 females and 25,936 males, a greater percentage of males were sentenced to immediate custody than females, 29% compared with 17%, which has been the case in each year since 2005. So those people who have had the briefing from the Prison Reform Trust, which tries to persuade them that women with no previous convictions are more likely to be sent to prison than men, that is categorically not the case, as the Ministry of Justice's own publication makes abundantly clear. Of course I will.
I'm very grateful for him giving way, and I do congratulate him for providing us with this opportunity to help him with his understanding of this issue. But isn't it right that first offending, convictions for first offence for women offenders for the same offence, they are more likely to receive a custodial sentence? And I don't think he's got the figures for that.
No, they're not, Mrs Osborne. That's the whole point. They are not. For every category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. And according to the Ministry of Justice's own publication, first-time offenders, men are not just slightly, they're much more likely to be sent to prison than women. That is the facts.
So if I can just explain again, what I'm saying is that for the same offence for the first time. Now, what the gentleman has the figures for is first-time offending overall and for different categories of offence. But if you take the same offence for men and for women, for the first conviction, they are more likely to get a custodial sentence.
No, they are not, Mrs Osborne. They are not. And I've got, for the benefit of the Honourable Lady, I've got every single category of offence, and I've got the likelihood of men and women for exactly the same offence being sent to prison. I'm afraid what she's saying is simply not the case. The Home Office undertook statistical research some years ago to try to ascertain the best comparison for similar situations. Report that it was a Home Office research study, 170, Understanding the Sentences of Women, edited by Carol Hederman and Lorraine Gelsthorpe. This research looked at 13,000 cases and concluded that women shoplifters were less likely than comparable males to receive a prison sentence. Among repeat offenders, women were less likely to receive a custodial sentence. Women first offenders were significantly less likely than equivalent men to receive a prison sentence for a drug offence. The Ministry of Justice's publication I mentioned earlier also covers the issue of pre-sentence reports and their recommendations for sentences in the courts. It says in 2009, a lower proportion of women who had a pre-sentence report that recommended immediate custody went on to receive this sentence than men. 83% of women who were recommended for immediate custody were sentenced to prison, whereas 90% of men were. For all other sentence options recommended in pre-sentence reports, suspended sentence order, all community sentences or fines, a higher proportion of males received custodial sentences than females. So even probation officers, and we all know how soft on sentencing they are, Even probation officers are recommending a higher number of custodial sentences than are actually given, and women again are on the receiving end of this particular benefit. Of course I will.
I congratulate him on securing this debate. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with the entire thrust of what he's saying, but what he surely is driving at is the argument behind his thesis is that women are being treated more preferentially. Would he accept at the very least that one of the reasons why women should, I suggest, be treated more preferentially, as the mother of children, they are in a position that they are therefore have got to look after those who might, if they are not present and able to support them, lapse into the criminal justice system, which is one thing which I'm sure he would wish to agree with.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend. I'm going to come on to the issue about women looking after children. As it happens, there's actually a large number of women, mothers, who are sent to prison, who are actually no longer looking after their children when they're sent to prison. But I'll come on to that a bit later. But the point is, my honourable friend makes a reasonable point. And that is that there may well be good reasons for women to be treated more favourably in the criminal justice system, in the courts, than men. That's a perfectly legitimate argument to follow. My point is this, that if people want to use the facts to prove that women are treated more favourably than men, and then actually give reasons for why that should be the case, I'm perfectly content for them to do so. What I can't allow to happen is this myth to perpetuate that women are treated more harshly in the sentencing regime than men, because that palpably is not the case. And if we can start having a debate along the lines that my honourable friend suggests, I would be perfectly happy. But we're a long way away from even getting to that particular point, I'm afraid, at the moment. In addition to the undeniable evidence that women are less likely to be sent to prison than men, is the fact that their average sentence length is less than those of men too. Again, I refer to the Ministry of Justice's own published figures. Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System, November 2010. In 2009, it says, women given an immediate custodial sentence for indictable offences received shorter average sentence lengths than men, 11 months compared to 17 months for men. This is not a minor difference. This figure shows that the average male prison sentence is over 50% more than the average female prison sentence. That's something that those who allege to be so keen on equality should think about. Of course, I'll give way.
And it is, of course, important to understand what some of the factors behind these figures might be. For example, a substantially higher proportion of women in prison are first-time offenders, 29% compared with 12% of men. Naturally, therefore, you would expect the sentencing for first-time offenders to be set at a lower level than for those with a pattern of offending behaviour. Now, I'm not suggesting, Mrs Osborne, that explains all of the difference in the figures, but I do think that it's important that the honourable gentleman gives us the full analysis and not just the headlines.
Well, it's equally important, Mrs Osborne, that the Honourable Lady listens to what I'm saying, because if she had have been listening to what I'm saying, rather than perhaps wrapped up in her brief from the Prison Reform Trust, she would have known that I'll just repeat it for her benefit. We've all heard it once, but I'll repeat it for her benefit. This is from the Ministry of Justice's own publication, Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System. Of sentenced first-time offenders, 7,320 females and 25,936 males, a greater percentage of males were sentenced to immediate custody than females, 29% compared with 17%, which has been the case in each year since 2005. So rather than the Honourable Lady suggesting that more female first-time offenders are more likely to be sent to prison than men, that is simply not the case. She's saying that a higher proportion of women in prison are first-time offenders. That's because they're so less likely to be sent to prison unless they commit particularly serious offences where the courts have got no option but to send them to prison. It's a complete distortion of the facts, and the Ministry of Justice publication makes that perfectly clear. Of course.
For my benefit, could the honourable gentleman just explain to me, for my benefit, clarify is probably the best word, but do all of these statistics take into account the type and gravity of offence, previous offending history, and all relevant mitigating factors, which, of course, sentencers are required to consider? It would be an unjust system if they failed to do that, and I wonder if you could just clear that point up for me.
Yes, they do, Mrs Osborne, and again, I will happily supply the Minister with the relevant information from the House of Commons Library, which goes to show, beyond all doubt, and it's from her department, and I'm sure she trusts the figures from her own department, that goes to show that for every single category of offence, for all ages, in all types of court, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. There's not even one little blip anywhere. For every single offence, for every age, in every type of court, women are much more likely less likely to be sent to prison than men.
David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr Osborne. I'm grateful to my honourable friend for giving away. The point raised by the Minister is indeed an important one, but surely these other factors that have to be taken into account on sentencing would actually would not affect the statistics, because they would be taken into account whether it was male or female. So, in fact, one assumes that they would take them into account on both sexes, so they won't affect the statistics.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and he is, of course, right. So not only are women less likely to be sent to prison than men, they're likely to be sentenced to a lesser term than their male counterparts. I'll give way in a second. But they are also more likely to serve less of the sentence they are given in prison. The Ministry of Justice itself says in its offender management statistics, 23rd of July 2012, those discharged from determinate sentences in the quarter ending December 2011 had served 53% of their sentence in custody, including time on remand. On average, males served a greater proportion of their sentences in custody, 53%, compared to 48% for females in the quarter ending December 2011. This gender difference is consistent over time and partly reflects the higher proportion of females who are released on home detention curfew. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Could the Honourable Gentleman clarify to what extent family circumstances, and particularly those of children, might be taken into account in terms of sentences, not around the offence, but in terms of sentencing? Every year, 18,000 children see their mothers go to prison, and only 5% of those children stay in their homes during that sentence. There are also statistics that suggest a third of women in prison are lone parents, and it's more likely that their children will lose their homes or be placed in care as a consequence of their mother's custody.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right. That is a factor that's given heavily in the courts, which is one of the explanations for why women are less likely to be sent to prison than men, which is the point that my honourable friend made earlier. And just to emphasise the point, Mrs Osborne, we had a case earlier this year, Rebecca Bernard, 51 previous convictions for crimes, including violence and threatening behaviour. She led an all-girl gang that brought terror to their town, has been the subject of 2 ASBOs for making her elderly neighbours' lives a misery. You might have thought that when this particular 23-year-old attacked 2 innocent men in a nightclub with a champagne bottle, a custodial sentence would be inevitable. But she walked free from court after a judge decided she was a good mother to her 3 young children. Bernard had smashed a bottle over one victim's head, then stabbed the other in the arm with its jagged neck. A court heard that she launched the attack because she believed wrongly that the men were laughing at her. So quite clearly these factors are taken into account by the courts. This explains why somebody like that, who clearly should have been sent to prison, who if had been a male would definitely have been sent to prison, in that particular case wasn't sent to prison. That is the explanation. I'm perfectly content for the Honourable Lady to make the case that that should be the case, but at least let's argue from the facts, and at least we're beginning to acknowledge that men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. Give way to my honourable friend.
I understand the basis of which my honourable friend is making his case, but is he going to be addressing the nature of the actual sentence to female offenders and the degree to which they are required to either work, take literacy lessons as part of the offending management, and also address drug and alcohol addiction?
No, I'm not, Mrs Osborne, because that's a debate for another day. They are all important issues. But the point that this particular debate is addressing is the sentencing of female offenders. And I'm concentrating here on in terms of whether the likelihood of people being sent to prison. If my honourable friend was listening carefully at the start, the myth I am currently exposing is that women are more likely to be sent to prison than men. That is quite palpably, from the figures I've just quoted, not the case. I will go through other myths as we go through time, but there may well not be time to go through every aspect of the criminal justice system at the moment. I will give way.
I think it is important to clarify. In terms of mitigation, does the honourable gentleman not accept that there may actually be some factors that are more appropriate or more relevant to women rather than men, hence the difference, by way of example, domestic violence, self-harm, mental ill health and caring responsibilities?
Well, I will come on to some of those points later, Mrs Osborne, but as it happens, and as she will know from her department's own figures, there are actually quite a lot of domestic violence victims who are men. In fact, for certain ages, I think it's between 20 and 30, there are more male victims of domestic violence than female. So the point is that all of the things that apply... the Minister shakes her head. I know she hasn't been in her post long, but I advise her to go and look at the figures for domestic violence for different age ranges, the Ministry of Justice, because they were the figures that they quoted to me in a parliamentary answer about 3 or 4 years ago. Now, they may well have changed, but if she wants to, I would urge her to at least go and look at them before she shakes her head. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I led an hour-and-a-half debate on domestic violence just before the recess here, which a number of members contributed to. I completely agree that there are many men who are victims of domestic violence. However, a number of studies have shown, I think as many as half of all the women in jail at the moment have been victims of domestic violence, and almost a third of all female prisoners have been victims of sexual abuse. So I think it is a very relevant factor, and I hope, I don't want to get into a statistical argument with my honourable friend, but I hope that this debate will broaden into some of the other challenges faced by female prisoners and some of the things that have to be taken into account in sentencing.
Well, Mrs. Osborne, I'm elated because we appear now to have a consensus in the room. That is an acceptance at last that men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. What we are now hearing from a variety of people are reasons why that should be the case. Now, they may well be true. That's a debate for another day. But at least we are getting to the nub of the purpose of my particular debate, which was to show that men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. I'm going to come on to the women who are in prison, and perhaps my honourable friend might like to explain which of the women in prison he would like to see released. Perhaps other members could do too. But we'll come on to that. That's the second myth. I'm just going to finish off on my first one, Mrs Osborne. And that is that all other Ministry of Justice figures confirm that men are treated more harshly by the courts than women, that there is quite a disparity. And in the last few years, the figures were published, women had a 50% more chance than men to be released from prison early on home detention curfew. So it's perfectly clear that the likelihood of being sent to prison, on the length of sentence handed out, and the proportion of sentence served, women are treated more favourably than men, and that applies to all ages, all categories of offences in Crown Courts and Magistrates' Courts. So that, at least we've made that particular point clear. Now, the second myth, which my honourable friend from Pendle may well be interested in, is that most women are in prison for petty or non-violent offences and are serving short sentences. That's the second myth. Many campaigners say that far too many women are in prison and that they should not be there, that they should be serving their sentences in the community instead. If we take a snapshot of the sentenced female prison population at a moment in time, and the last figures I have, Mrs Osborne, are for June 2010, let's just look at the actual detail of all of these poor women serving prison sentences who should apparently be out and about. Which of these do those who advocate reducing the female prison sentence actually want to let out? And I'm happy for people. In fact, Francis Crook, the director of the Howard League for Penal Reform, was quoted in The Guardian in 2007 as saying that for women who offend, prison simply doesn't work. It is time to end the use of traditional prisons for women. Perhaps she might be able to explain which of these particular women she would like to see out and about and not serving a prison sentence. Maybe it's the 211 serving sentences for murder. Maybe it's the 135 in prison for manslaughter or attempted homicide. Maybe it's the 352 convicted of wounding, the 142 for serious assaults or other violence against the person, or maybe it's the 58 for cruelty to children. It could be the 83 that are in for rape, gross indecency with children, or other sexual offences. Maybe it's the 272 that are in for violent robbery, or the 151 who are in for burglary. Maybe it's the 398 drug dealers who shouldn't be in prison. That total, Mrs Osborne, comes to about 1,800, just over 1,800, which is a figure that's often bandied around as the target for women offenders in prison. So maybe they would say, well, those people should be in prison. It's the others who shouldn't be in prison. So, there are some, as I've indicated, that say that no women should be in prison at all. But that's just so ridiculous that I'm hoping that nobody here is in favour of that. Of course I'll give way.
The Honourable Gentleman, I'm sure he will agree that prison serves a number of purposes. One is the protection of the public. Another, though, of course, is to attempt to rehabilitate and prevent reoffending in the future. It's pretty clear that prison is not doing a very good job at that, for all sorts of reasons, both for women and for men. And the protection of the public could be achieved better through dedicated, secure units for women, rather than putting them into a system which is predominantly designed for a male lifestyle, male behaviours, and which therefore incarcerates them around masculine-led regimes.
Philip Davies.
But most of these people are in these are in women's prisons. They're not masculine regimes, they're in female prisons. For goodness sake. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
Guy Opperman.
Everybody accepts that the women are in women's prisons. But at the same stage, you cannot ignore a statistic that says upwards of 70% of offenders, male or female, are reoffending. Therefore, does my honourable friend accept that we have to look at a different approach, not just to how we sentence male offenders, both governments having in the last 5 to 10 years trying to do that, but also how we sentence and deal with female offenders?
Philip Davies.
Might be right if it weren't the case that, according to the Ministry of Justice, which I'm sure is true, the longer people spend in prison, the less likely they are to reoffend, quite markedly. The high rates of reoffending he mentions are only relate to people who should spend short periods of time in prison. The longer people spend in prison, they are less likely to reoffend. The figures are something like, up to 12 months, 61% of people reoffend. 1 to 2 years, it goes down to about 47%. 2 to 4 years, it's about 37%. And 4 years plus, it's down at about 17%. So the longer people spend in prison, the less likely they are to reoffend. Now, if my honourable friend and other people are suggesting that the... Hold on. If my honourable friend and other people are suggesting that the 5,442 women who are sent to prison each year for up to 6 months shouldn't be in prison, they presumably must also be saying that the 51,588 males who are sent to prison each year for under 6 months also shouldn't be in prison. Now, if people wish to go around their constituencies, and I will look forward to their election address, and the honourable lady may well send me a copy of her election address at the general election. If she would like to argue that each year, those who spend up to a year, sentenced up to a year in prison, that's 70,000 people who are sent to prison for less than a year each year, if she wants to go around her constituency, blazoning it all over to say that those people shouldn't be sent to prison, then I will look forward to her issuing that leaflet out around her constituency. If she won't do it, I may well do it for her. I'll give way.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. As he knows, I represent a Manchester constituency where we have been piloting intensive alternatives to custody. In other words, for people who would otherwise meet the custody threshold, so would go to prison, and would receive a short prison sentence of under 6 months. Instead, they're diverted to community penalties. I must tell the honourable gentleman, not only is that producing better reoffending rates, lower reoffending rates, it's also very popular in Manchester. So I think he shouldn't make a simplistic assumption that my constituents are not prepared to look at the deeper arguments around when custody works.
Well, I'll make an offer today. I'm happy to go to Manchester and debate sentencing with her any time that she wants to fix one up, and we'll see what the majority of her constituents actually think. Well, the point, in a second, the point that the honourable lady makes, I think, is nonsense. But if she wants to argue that point, it's perfectly fair. But the point is, those things apply to men more than women. So this argument that this is all about women is a complete nonsense. All of these issues relate to men just as equally as they do to women. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
All of us in this House would agree that those who are convicted of serious offences should go to prison. That is not in dispute. Neither is in dispute a desire to actually make the prison more effective at stopping rehabilitation, at creating rehabilitation. But on the statistics that my honourable friend has produced, whereby longer sentences produce less likely of reoffending, does he therefore not accept the overwhelming logic that therefore short sentences which don't stop reoffending mean that short sentences are not necessarily working?
Philip
No,
Davies.
we're getting slightly off the point, Mrs Osborne, but I will address my honourable friend's point. No, they don't suggest that. They suggest two things. The first is that they suggest that people should perhaps have longer sentences where the reoffending rate is lower, not no sentence at all. It's an argument, the high reoffending rate for short sentences is an argument for longer sentences, not for no sentences. The second point is that in order to get to prison, for most people, you have to commit very many offences. And actually, if you go to court with over 100 previous convictions behind you, you are more likely not to be sent to prison than to be sent to prison. So the reoffending rate, these people have had community sentence after community sentence after community sentence. The only reason they're going to prison is because the community sentences haven't worked, haven't stopped them reoffending. So actually the reoffending rate for those people in prison is lower for that cohort of people than it is for those people when they were on community sentences. So on all of those levels. I'm very conscious of time, Mrs Osborne. I'll give way for one last time because otherwise there will be no one else speaking by me.
I understand. My honourable friend has been very reasonable indeed, and clearly he's worked extremely hard on collating these statistics. But I just wonder whether he has himself actually visited a female prison, and also has he visited some of the alternatives to custody, one of which was referred to by the honourable member sitting opposite to me.
I have indeed, Mrs Osborne. I've visited the intensive alternatives to custody in my part of the world as well. I've visited, I think, 12 prisons in the UK, including Holloway, and also a women's prison up in Yorkshire too. So I've visited 2 women's prisons in the UK. I've also visited prisons in Denmark and the USA to see what they do too. So if my honourable friend was trying to suggest that I didn't know what I was talking about, I hopefully have made aware that actually I have got some experience in this particular field. So interestingly enough, nobody has yet managed to tell me which of those people I listed shouldn't be in prison that are in prison. It seems to me perhaps we have a consensus that actually these people should be in prison. But if people want to limit it there at that 1,800, let's see which of these people that should be let out of prison. Maybe it's the 91 arsonists that are in prison, female arsonists that are in prison. Maybe it's the 24 convicted of violent disorder, or the 45 serving time for kidnapping and blackmail. Maybe it's the 192 that are in there for serious fraud and forgery. Maybe it's the 320 who have been convicted of importing drugs into the country that end up being sold onto our streets. Or maybe the 111 serving time for other serious drug offences. If we don't want to let them all out, then we appear to be running out of options. Perhaps people will tell us which ones of those they think shouldn't be in prison. I'm delighted for the Shadow Minister to tell us which the Labour Party doesn't believe of those should be in prison.
Jenny Chapp.
The Labour Party believes, and I think we have your Minister's agreement with this, that it's not about letting people out, it's about preventing them getting there in the first place. And we want to see proper interventions that work and are properly resourced earlier on in people's criminal careers to prevent them having to go to prison. That is the point we're trying to make.
Well, with respect, that isn't the point that people make, because that applies to men just as equally as women. So when we hear in debates, in questions, all of this thing that women are treated more harshly than men, it's no good talking about these things because these apply equally to men and women. So nobody has yet been able to identify where women are treated more harshly in the criminal justice system. That's the whole point of my particular debate. I think maybe it's perhaps we're coming down to in other numbers, it's the 24 who are in for perjury.
Order. There's a division. The sitting is suspended for 15 minutes.
I'd have known that, but waited. I didn't realise.
Do we know what this is a vote on?
Philip Davies.
Thank you, Mrs Osborne. As I was saying, it appears that nobody has yet been able to tell us which of those people shouldn't be in prison. So I can only presume that given that, we can all only conclude that all of those people should be in prison, and so therefore we don't really have a problem. And I just want to decouple one other thing, that the number of women sentenced to short sentences in any 1 year is one figure, but it's a completely different figure to the female prison population at any one time. Looking at recent figures as an example, just under 16% of women are in prison for sentences of less than 6 months. This is very clearly a minority. If you do not class that as a short sentence, then a further 6% are in prison for up to 1 year. So 22% of female prisoners are in custody for up to 12 months, which covers all cases heard in magistrates' courts and some cases from Crown courts. All the rest of women offenders are serving sentences of over 1 year, which means their offences were so serious that they would have to have been dealt with at a Crown court. This puts these women, 78% of the total female prison population, not as those serving short sentences for not-so-serious offences, as people would have us believe, but serving much longer sentences for the most serious crimes. The figure of 78% of the female prison population comprises 34% serving between 1 and 4 years, 28% serving sentences of 4 years to life, and 11% serving indeterminate sentences. A further 5% of offenders are in prison, as after being previously released, they have either reoffended or breached their licence conditions. So that's the second myth, that women prisoners tend to be in prison for short sentences and not very serious offences. The third myth is that women are often remanded in custody and then do not get sentenced to custody. I have heard the misuse of many statistics over the issue of remand and female offenders, and I want to introduce the House to the real facts. The Ministry of Justice's own figures show that women are more likely to get bail than men. This is in Statistics on Women and the Criminal Justice System, November 2010. In 2009, 80% of females were bailed, compared with 62% of males, and 20% were remanded in custody, compared with 38% of males. So the percentage remanded for both males and females is at a 5-year low. These figures also back up, yet again, that more men than women are sentenced to custody, as it goes on to say, of those remanded in custody, 66% of females were then sentenced to immediate custody, in comparison with 75% of males. So when people complain about women being more likely to be remanded in custody and then not sent to prison, that is only solely due to women being treated more favourably when being sentenced, not that they're being more harshly treated when the decision is made to remand them in custody or give them bail. Those figures, again, are perfectly clear. Yet another deliberate myth. The fourth myth is about how prison separates mothers from their children and how this unfairly punishes them. It's said that 17,000 children are separated from their mothers and that 60% of women in custody have children under the age of 18. It is also suggested that about 700 out of over 4,000 women are in prisons over 100 miles away from their children. So let's take this in stages. First of all, it's not the system that separates any mother from their children. It is that individual's actions in breaking the law that have led them to be in prison. And that is almost certainly 100% their fault and their responsibility alone. As we already know from the evidence, they are less likely to go to prison than men. In addition, sentencing guidelines updated in recent times also incorporate the consideration of the effect that custody would have on others where the defendant is the primary carer for another, which again is likely to further benefit more women than men when it comes to being sentenced. But if we are so concerned about the children of women offenders, what about the estimated 180,000 children who are separated from their fathers because they are in prison? In this age of equality, what about this much higher figure? Should we not be more or at least equally outraged about this? And if not, why not? Some women may be further away from their children than others in prison, but let's turn to the main point about all these women who are allegedly being so unfairly dragged away from their poor children by overly harsh magistrates and judges. This is another big myth. My understanding is that a senior civil servant at the Ministry of Justice has helpfully confirmed recently that 2/3 of the mothers sent to prison who have children were not even looking after them at the time. She apparently said of the women being sent to prison, 2/3 of them don't have their kids living with them when they went into prison. So why on earth is there all this huge outcry about separating mothers from their children when most of the mothers in prison were not being mothers to their children anyway? I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Penny Chapman.
I do congratulate the Honourable Gentleman, and he marshals his argument very, very well, and he makes good use of statistics up to a point. But on this, I really must differ with him. You know, only 5% of children with a mother in custody are able to stay in their own homes, and that is not the case for men. And I just wonder what he thinks about that, and what that does when we look at offending of people who have parents in custody. We know that they are much more likely to commit offences themselves in future, and we are trying desperately hard to break this pattern of offending. And you know, it seems to me quite an obvious step to take to try and keep those relationships alive, because we know that, especially with women, that is one of the single most important factors in preventing their reoffending.
But Mrs Osborne, my point is that men are parents as well as women. The problems that the Honourable Lady articulates apply to men as well as women. The point I'm trying to make is that the argument goes that this is all about women. It's not all about women. Let's just not focus on this very small proportion of women who are in prison. Let's also think about all of the men too. And that's the point. The whole point of this debate is to try and make people aware that where there are issues, they apply equally to men, or some of the issues aren't even issues at all because the facts don't back them up. I'm going to give way for one last thing, because otherwise no one will get a chance to speak.
Just on the matter of these mother and baby units, and it's not, with the greatest of respect, all about the mother. The principal criteria for entering that mother and baby unit is that it must be in the best interest of that child. That is the most important criteria. Would he not accept that?
Well,
Philip Davies.
The point I've made so far, Mrs Osborne, is that 66% of women being sent to prison who are children are not actually looking after their children when they're sent to prison. That's the point I'm making at the moment. So I'm not entirely sure why we're all pulling our hair out about this particular issue, and for those people who aren't even looking after their children. These children have probably either been put into care, are being looked after by other family members, probably because the mother is considered to be an unfit mother to look after the children. So why should the courts then treat her less harshly when the children have already been removed from her? It's a completely spurious argument. When it comes to the minority who are actually looking after their children, we might also want to bear in mind that we shouldn't particularly assume that they are all fantastic mothers and role models for their children either. Many will be persistent offenders with chaotic lifestyles. Some will end up dragging their children into their criminal lifestyles, and some will scar their children for life along the way. So perhaps we're also presuming it's in the children's best interest for these mothers to stay with it. It may not be in the best interest for the mother to be released back out to the child. It may well be for their best interest that the mother does go to prison in some of these cases. Others will have committed very serious offences. Again, the same official from the Ministry of Justice said recently of women offenders, they can be very damaged, but also very damaging. And I think that's absolutely right. As Sarah Salmon from the Action for Prisoners' Families said, for some families, the mother going into prison is a relief because she has been causing merry hell in the family. And again, I think that's a worthy point that we ought to consider. And let us not finally forget those who are in prison for being cruel to their children, for actually abusing their own children. The final myth, Mrs Osborne, is that women are treated more harshly in the justice system than men generally. It's quite clear that women are less likely to be sent to prison than men, so we need to look at other court disposals to see if they are then treated more harshly than men in other areas. If they are not being sent to prison as frequently as men, then they are presumably being sentenced at the next level down to a community order. Actually, they're not. The Ministry of Justice's figures yet again show that men are more likely to receive a community order than women. 10% of women sentenced are given a community order compared to 16% of men. The Ministry of Justice goes on to confirm, and I quote, "These patterns were broadly consistent in each of the last 5 years." So women are less likely to go to prison than men, and they're less likely to be given a community order than men. But that is not all. Of those who are given a community order, the ones given to men are likely to be much harsher. The Ministry of Justice says the average length of all community sentences for men was longer than for women. And for women receiving a community order, the largest proportion had one requirement, whereas the largest proportion of men had two requirements. Now, I don't want to veer into the realms of domestic violence that my honourable friend for Pendle tried to go down. That's a debate for another day. But one thing that's worth noting when it comes to sentencing is that despite all the evidence that shows women as the perpetrators of domestic violence in far more cases than some would like us to think, the community requirement that is imposed on those who commit an offence in a domestic setting is only imposed on men and cannot be handed down to women. As usual, this shows that the whole issue of equality only works one way, even when we're dealing with exactly the same offence. Given the more severe sentences for men at the higher end of the sentencing spectrum, it is unsurprising, therefore, that women were more likely to receive the low levels of punishment at courts. It is a fact that a higher proportion of female defendants receive fines than males. All of this shows that throughout the court sentencing regime, men are, on average, treated more severely than women. Yet before I conclude, there is another interesting statistic that's worth sharing. There is even an imbalance in the number of women ever reaching court compared to men, as more females than men were issued with pre-court sanctions. This has been consistently the case in recent years, according to the Ministry of Justice. So that is the evidence. All of the hysteria surrounding women in the justice system, I suggest, is completely without foundation. And yet people want to be seen to be doing something about this particular so-called problem. We have the Together Women programme, women-only groups for community sentences, a criminal justice women's strategy unit, women's centres, a proposal for women-only courts, and just the other day in Manchester, the Honourable Member for Tooting proposed a Women's Justice Board. This is all on top of the Corson report, which looked into the whole issue of female offenders and came up with even more suggestions for things that should be done. If you look at the evidence, there does appear to be sex discrimination in the sentencing of offenders. But the people being discriminated against are men, not women. Women cannot have it both ways. They can't expect to be treated equally in everything in society, except when it comes to being sentenced by the courts for the crimes that they commit. People may want to argue that it's reasonable for women to be given lighter sentences than men, that it's right that fewer women are sent to prison than men. That's an argument again for another day. But at least when we have these debates about sentencing for men and sentencing for women, let's actually stick to the facts as they are, not what we'd like them to be, which is that men are treated more harshly by the courts than women. If we can at least have debates flowing from that, based on the facts, then at least we'll have made a good start today.
I call Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mrs Osborne. It is a pleasure to take part in this debate, and I do congratulate the Honourable Member for Shipley for securing the debate. I think it is actually a very useful thing to make these debates formed on the basis of fact, and I think we will all be going away and having another look at some of the statistics around this area. But I don't think that that will necessarily mean that we all jump to the same conclusion as the Honourable Member for Shipley has. And I do take exception to the charge, I think, of inappropriate political correctness and hysteria on my part and that of the Honourable Member for Maidstone. I think what we're trying to do here is devise a criminal justice system that is sensible and just and effective, and helps to reduce reoffending and reduce the number of victims. And I think that's something that we all share, and we are trying to do that within a very, very tight budget. And I've agreed in the past with the Honourable Member for Shipley on issues like indeterminate sentencing, and I do think that it's slightly rich to then say that we're all getting a bit woolly-headed and soft over this. We're not. We're trying to deal with this sensibly. And so if we do take a look at what we know about women in the criminal justice system, the first thing we see is that there are far fewer of them than there are of male offenders. And as the Honourable Member of Shipley has said, they make up only 5% of the prison population. But their being a minority has meant in the past that they've not been as appropriately served as the male population. And we know, for example, that as well as committing less crime, the female population tend to commit different types of offences of crime to men. And importantly, they are likely to commit less violent crime. And conversely, we know that they're more likely than their male counterparts to be given a custodial sentence for their first offence. Now, we will obviously all be going away and frantically trying to check that out. And their most common offence does seem to be theft, and particularly shoplifting. We know that once there, women experience prison very differently to men, and despite inhabiting only 5% of our cell spaces, female offenders account for nearly 50% of all incidents of self-harm that happen inside prison walls. And we know that the majority of women in prison are serving short sentences of 6 months or less. And we know that once out, the majority of them do reoffend and will be back within a year. So clearly something is not working. I give way.
Davies.
I can only conclude that the Honourable Lady didn't listen to what I said. The fact is that if you take at any point in time, 78% of women in prison are in prison serving a sentence of over 1 year. 78% are in prison for serving a sentence of over 1 year. It's simply not true to say that the majority of women in a prison today are serving a short sentence. They're not.
I should be more clear. The majority of women sentenced serve less than 6 months. It goes without saying that serious and violent offenders, whether men or women, should be punished and imprisoned in order to protect the public and to punish them. But it also does need to be said that the majority of women seen by sentences have committed minor non-violent offences, and we are aware that this is seen by sentences, not necessarily convicted, and we are aware that our new Secretary of State for Justice is keen to tell us that prison works. But when 62% of women who serve these short sentences go out and quickly reoffend, it's a sure sign that something is not working. Now, the Honourable Gentleman would like us to see longer sentences, I'm sure, for all classes of offender, but I'm very curious to know where the budget for this is going to come from. I give way.
Davies.
For the extra resources for the prison budget to come from, a starter would be the £19 billion a year we give to the European Union. Perhaps the vast increase we've had recently in overseas aid, perhaps the money that we give to India might be a good place to start to actually have some prison places in this country.
Chapman.
I really should have thought before I said that. I could have predicted that answer very, very easily myself. And I do look forward to, once again, the Honourable Member raising this with the leader of his party. In 2007, the Labour government published the Corston report, which was commissioned precisely to consider this cohort of offenders. And irritating though it is to the Honourable Gentleman, we do still believe that there are specific things that can be done for this group of offenders to reduce their reoffending that are not currently taking place, and they are different to those interventions that may be successful for male offenders. Over 50% of the women in prison report that they've experienced domestic abuse. 1 in 3 of them has suffered sexual abuse, and 1/4 of women in prison were in care as children. They're disproportionately more likely to suffer from serious mental health problems than either male offenders or the wider population, and 37% of women sent to prison say they've attempted suicide at some point in their lives. 74% of them left school before they were 16, and drugs and substance misuse were also disproportionately a factor in women's offending prior to entering custody. 75% of women had used illegal drugs. Now, I've already mentioned the appallingly high level of self-harm that occurs in this population. Baroness Corston was led to describe these women as troubled rather than simply troubling, although they certainly can be troublesome, and a short prison sentence mandated on top of an already chaotic life does little to address the root causes of offending. The problems that were there before she entered the gates will be there when she leaves them. Only now there might be more, as 30% of women lose their accommodation while in custody, and many of them have inadequate housing or were homeless before arrest, and they're not the only ones at risk of losing their homes due to imprisonment. Nearly 18,000 children are separated from their mothers every year by a prison sentence. Female offenders are often the primary or sole carer in a family, and this is where they do differ from male offenders. 60% of women in prison have dependent children under the age of 18, and only 5% of them, with a mother in custody, are able to stay in their own homes while their mum is inside. And the burden does often fall on extended family members or indeed the care system. So we cannot afford to inappropriately sentence female offenders who do not pose a serious risk to the public. It costs too much, it costs children and their family and their homes, and it makes it harder for women who are often vulnerable or victims in their own right to get their lives back on track. It condemns communities to have offenders return to their streets without any meaningful preventative work having been done, and on top of it all, it does quite simply cost too much. The Prison Reform Trust, who I know the Honourable Member for Shipley holds in very high regard, report that it costs an average of £49,000 per year to hold a woman in prison. The Independent recently ran an article, which I'm sure the member for Shipley also reads very carefully, recently ran an article about a woman who'd been sent to prison for stealing a lasagna. The ex-governor of Style Women's Prison tells a story of a woman who was given a custodial sentence for stealing a sandwich because she was hungry. And in a women's centre in Manchester early this month, I was talking to a woman who'd been made homeless due to domestic abuse and had been sent to prison after committing petty theft to survive. She stole a sandwich. And I'd like to reiterate that there are crimes where a custodial sentence is, of course, the most appropriate punishment for an offender, female or not, but where a custodial sentence is disproportionate or ineffective, as is clearly suggested by current reoffending rates, well, that's an awful lot to pay for a solution that solves very little. Baroness Corston made a series of recommendations about changes that needed to be made to the content and provision of women's sentences. And her report was greeted with strong support by all parties, including the two that now sit opposite, or the one that now sits opposite me. I will.
Philip Davies.
Is she claiming that somebody was sent to prison for stealing a sandwich as a first offence? Is that really what she's claiming? Because I find that very, very hard to believe. And if people are sent to prison in what she considers to be for minor offences, then I can guarantee that men are more likely to be sent to prison for those offences, because for every category of crime, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women. So it applies equally to men, not just women.
No, of course, that is true. And I think, if there's something positive that can come out of this debate, it may be a sense that the issues that we raise concerning women, we don't just raise solely. We're not just concerned about women offenders, but it is true that that group of offenders, if dealt with in a slightly different way, we could have much more success with. And, given that we have such a problem with reoffending, it makes perfect sense to me to try and break this down and deal with groups of offenders where we can have some success first. So the Labour government did accept almost all of Corston's 43 recommendations, and a lot of very good progress was made. 5 years on, some of the achievements that we should be most proud of are the end to mandatory strip searching and targeted investment in community and diversion services for women. And I must pay tribute to my honourable friend, the member for Garston and Halewood, who, according to the Right Honourable Member for Blackburn, argued ferociously for change and she did not stop until she got her way. A fine example of the effectiveness of a women's justice champion, a role which has sadly been conspicuous by its absence in the first 2 years of this government. Because progress, I'm disappointed to report, has stalled, and I noted already that the current Secretary of State for Justice has not found time to make women a priority in his conference speech. But to be fair to him, he's simply following the example set by the government that did not include a single mention of female offenders in a bill the size and scope of the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishing of Offenders Bill. The Secretary of State has made much of his desire to be tough on crime, and even more perhaps of his very fractious relationship with community sentencing. But this is not about being hard or soft. This is about what works, and smart community interventions are the most effective way of sentencing and rehabilitating the majority of women that enter the criminal justice system. Reform in this area is tough on crime as it reduces it. And when I asked staff and service users at the Pankhurst Women's Centre in Manchester what needed to change, they answered that politicians needed to grow a backbone. Actually, they were a lot less polite than that, but I think we know what they meant. Labour in opposition has continued our commitment to this area of reform, and the Honourable Member for Tooting this month announced plans to set up a Women's Justice Board. Reducing the number of women in prison, he argued, should be a priority for any government. Now, the Secretary of State for Justice is not known for his desire to reduce the prison population, but if our criminal justice system is to be sensible, effective and value for money, it may be time for this government to think outside the gates.
Helen Grant.
Thank you, Mrs Osborne. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I congratulate my honourable friend for Shipley in bringing this debate. This is an important debate, and I welcome the opportunity to update the House on steps justice agencies are taking to address women's offending. Before doing so, I want to set out two important parts of the wider context on female offenders. One is to explain how the current sentencing framework deals with gender. The other is to show how important it is to look very carefully at the evidence on how women are sentenced by the courts. To begin with, it's important to be clear on how our sentencing framework is gender neutral. Everyone is absolutely equal before the law. The same criminal offences and maximum penalties apply to every case, regardless of the offender's gender. Alongside this, we also need to remember that every offender who comes before the court is unique. It's a long-standing principle of our justice system that courts should consider the full circumstances, not just of the offence, but also of the offender when sentencing. A sentencing framework that did not allow courts to take into account individual circumstances would not be a just one. In many cases, an offender's personal characteristics may be aggravating factors to be taken into account on sentencing. For example, previous convictions, failure to comply with previous court orders, or abusing a position of trust can all be treated as aggravating factors when sentencing. However, other personal characteristics may also provide mitigation. Previous good character, age, physical and mental health, and caring responsibilities are all factors that courts can take into account when deciding what is appropriate for a sentence. All of these factors may apply to both male and female offenders. For example, it is the fact that the offender is the primary carer for dependent relatives that is important for the court, not whether or not the offender is the mother or the father. Probation pre-sentence reports give courts the detailed assessments they need to make informed judgments about the factors that they should take into account. I should be clear that courts need to weigh mitigating factors against the other in all the circumstances. For example, although it is recognised that parental imprisonment can have considerable effect on the lives of children, caring responsibilities will not necessarily mean that the offender will be spared prison. The overriding aim of the courts will always be to impose a sentence that reflects the seriousness of the offence, one which is proportionate to the culpability of the offender and the harm they have caused. We need to bear in mind all these issues when looking at the sentences imposed on male and female offenders. Differences in the type and severity of sentences given to men and women may be attributable to a wide range of factors. For example, the type and gravity of the offence committed and the individual's previous offending history.
Will the Minister give way?
Yes.
Davies.
To that, is she therefore conceding, whilst not actually saying it explicitly, but by saying that there's reasons why this may be the case, as she was moving on to, is she at least conceding, which is the main purpose of my debate, that for each category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women?
No, I don't accept that at all. What I've just said is that the sentencing framework and the sentencing guidelines are gender neutral. Everyone is absolutely equal before the law. That's exactly what I've said. So we need to be very careful when interpreting the statistics.
Philip Davies.
I'll give her one more chance, because I wouldn't want her to inadvertently mislead the House, and she can use her Ministry of Justice figures for this answer. Will she accept that for each category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women? Whatever the we can take all the reasons why, we can put all the mitigating factors in, we can put all the reasons why that may be the case. Will she just confirm, for the benefit of the House, as the Minister for this department, that for each category of offence, men are more likely to be sent to prison than women? Because this really does get to the reasons are irrelevant, which are the facts we want at this stage.
Well, we could go around on circles on this, and I'm going to repeat myself again. the sentencing framework and the sentencing guidelines are gender neutral. Everyone is equal before the law. And the sentencer has an obligation to take all factors into consideration, factors related to the offence, but also the offender. And if the sentencer, within our judicial system, failed to do that, then we would have an unjust system. So we need to be very careful when interpreting the statistics, many of which have been provided by my honourable friend today. At a high level, for example, these show that in 2011, 10% of male offenders and 3% of female offenders were sentenced to immediate custody. The average custodial sentence length for males was longer than for females at 15 months and 10 months respectively. Equally, however, in 2011, proportionately more males than females received sentences for serious offences such as violent crime, sexual crime and robbery. There were also differences in the severity of offences committed within these groups. For example, 343 offenders in 2011 were sentenced for murder, but just 23 of these were female offenders. In terms of aggravating factors, the available statistics suggest that a similar proportion of males and females sentenced to short custodial sentences are persistent offenders. In June 2011, around half of both men and women serving sentences of 6 months or less in prison had 15 or more previous convictions. In terms of mitigation, there are a number of factors that are particularly associated with women offenders, including the high prevalence of mental health needs and childcare responsibilities. Prisoner surveys tell us that more than a quarter of female prisoners reported having been treated for mental health problems in the year before custody, compared to 16% of male prisoners. Women are also more likely than male offenders to have childcare responsibilities. 60% of mothers with children under the age of 18 lived with those children prior to imprisonment, compared with around 45% of fathers. So there is a nuanced story behind the statistics, one which reflects the fact that for every offender, whether male or female, the individual is unique. Whether they are punished in custody or in the community, the government is committed to ensuring that both men and women who offend are successfully rehabilitated. For those offenders best dealt with out of court, we're piloting mental health and substance misuse liaison and diversion services in police custody at courts by 2012. We're also developing intensive treatment options in the community for offenders with drug and mental health problems, including 4 women-only services in Wirral, Bristol, Birmingham and Tyneside. In prison, we're piloting drug recovery wings for short-sentence drug and alcohol-dependent prisoners at 3 women's prisons, HMP Newhall, Ascombe Grange and Style. We're also ensuring courts have the right mix of punitive and rehabilitative requirements available when sentencing female offenders to community sentences. The National Offenders Management Service is providing £3.78 million in this financial year to fund 31 women's community services, which can be used as part of or in conjunction with community sentences. To protect the provision of services for women in these times of financial challenge, this funding will be embedded within the baseline for future probation trust settlements, with a requirement that this results in enhanced services for women. We have issued gender-specific standards in all areas of the prison regime, including training for staff working with women offenders in prisons, and now extended to services provided in the outside community, and new search arrangements ending routine full searching for women prisoners. There are 7 mother and baby units in England and Wales, which provide an overall total capacity of 77 places for mothers, with a capacity of up to 84 places for babies to allow for twins. Mother and baby units provide a calm and friendly place within the prison for babies to live with their mother. They enable the mother and the child relationship to develop and thereby safeguard and promote the child's welfare. In closing, I would like to thank honourable members for Stretford and Urmston, Feltham and Heston, Pendle, Hexham and Darlington who have contributed to this debate. We can only continue to improve how we tackle offending together if we continue to address the wide range of factors associated with offending, whether offenders are male or whether offenders are female. I welcome the constructive and knowledgeable contributions from all honourable members this afternoon, which have highlighted how important it is that we continue to focus on responding to the specific circumstances of women offenders.